The soft glow from the candles flickered against the walls, painting the room in shades of amber and shadow. I sat frozen for a moment, my hand still in his, feeling an energy between us that was both thrilling and terrifying. Every rational thought about my marriage, my loyalty, and my life at home seemed to fade under the weight of the moment. He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," he said, letting his hand gently brush my cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself this was just a fleeting temptation, a harmless lapse. But it felt too real, too consuming. I could hear the music in the background, a slow rhythm that seemed to echo my racing heart. We were closer now than before, and I felt his presence like a magnetic force I couldn't resist. There was a pause, a quiet moment where neither of us spoke, but everything was being communicated in silence, the tension, the desire, the unspoken question lingering in the air. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He smiled softly, leaning even closer, his eyes searching mine. "I want you to be sure," he said. But there was an edge to his tone now, a quiet insistence, a force behind the invitation that I could not ignore. I felt my resolve weakening. Every warning in my mind was drowned out by the warmth of his hand, the brush of his arm against mine, and the strange, intoxicating thrill of being wanted so intensely. The rational part of me screamed to leave, to run back to the safety of my apartment, to the life I had built with my husband. Yet, another part, a part one barely recognized, wanted to surrender to this moment, to feel something new, something dangerous, something forbidden. He shifted slightly, closing the space between us. I could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and it seemed to mirror the chaos within me. My chest tightened as I realized I had reached a point of no return, the moment where curiosity and desire had fully overtaken caution. I opened my eyes slowly, meeting his gaze, and in that instant, everything changed. There was no longer hesitation, no lingering doubts, only a raw awareness of the intimacy building between us. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and I knew that what started as a casual visit had now become something far more potent. Even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my mind, I couldn't stop the pull toward him. The choice was mine, and yet it felt as if it had been made the moment I stepped into his house. Something inside me had shifted irrevocably, and I knew that after tonight, nothing would ever feel the same again. Right pointing arrow purpose of Part 3 recap. Bring the emotional and physical tension to its peak. Show the narrator struggling with guilt, desire, and inevitability. Highlight the turning point where temptation becomes almost irresistible. Set the stage for consequences and emotional fallout in Part 4. I can now create Part 4, 500 words, which would focus on the aftermath, consequences, and emotional resolution or cliffhanger. Do you want me to continue with that? To show the emotional and psychological consequences of the encounter, exploring guilt, temptation, and the tension between desire and commitment. This section provides closure for the story while leaving space for suspense or reflection, ideal for a faceless video. The night grew deeper, and the soft music in the background had long since faded into silence. I sat there, heart still racing, staring at my hands. The warmth of his presence lingered, and I could still feel the echoes of the tension between us. A part of me wanted to stay, to bask in the intimacy of the moment, but another part, the part that knew my life, my vows, my reality, screamed that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I looked at him, and he seemed calm, almost unaffected. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he knew exactly what had happened and was content to let me process it in my own time. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to make sense of my conflicting emotions, but the words wouldn't come. Guilt pressed against my chest like a heavy weight. I thought of my husband, of our home, of the life I had promised to protect. How could a simple visit turn into a night that left me questioning everything? The shame mixed with an undeniable thrill that made me feel both alive and utterly lost. I should go, I finally murmured, my voice barely audible. He nodded, understanding without a word. I'll walk you to the door, he said softly. His hand brushed mine one last time, a touch that lingered longer than it should have. The hallway felt colder than before, and I realized that leaving was not just a matter of physical distance, it was about stepping back into the reality I had momentarily abandoned. As I walked back through the quiet streets to my apartment, every shadow and flickering streetlight seemed to remind me of the choices I had made. The night air was crisp, yet it did little to cool the fire that burned inside me, a mix of guilt, desire, and the haunting memory of what had passed. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, taking deep, shaky breaths. I knew I could never undo the night, never erase the feelings that had surfaced. And yet, a part of me couldn't help but remember the warmth, the laughter, the magnetic pull that had drawn me closer. The tension between longing and loyalty settled uneasily in my chest. I knew that the next days, weeks, and months would be filled with questions, temptation, and self-reflection. I wasn't sure if my life would ever feel the same again. But one thing was clear, that night had changed me, irrevocably, unforgettably, and dangerously. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, yet deep down, I knew that this story was far from over. Something had been awakened inside me, something that might never truly sleep again. Right pointing arrow. Purpose of Part 4 Recap. Show the emotional aftermath and inner conflict. Explore guilt, temptation, and lasting consequences. Leave the ending open enough for suspense or continuation. Provide a reflective closure suitable for faceless storytelling. If you want, I can now create a full set of visual prompts, video structure, title, description, and hashtags for this story, optimized for a faceless video format. Do you want me to do that next?
That night, the house felt larger than usual, too quiet, too still. My husband had left earlier that morning for another work trip, and by evening, the silence had settled in like an unwanted guest. I moved from room to room, straightening things that didn't need fixing, just to feel busy. But no matter what I did, the emptiness lingered. We hadn't argued before he left. We rarely did anymore. Instead, there was a distance between us that felt harder to address, polite conversations, short calls, unspoken disappointments. I told myself this was normal. That marriages go through phases. Still, some nights, the loneliness felt heavier than it should have. I was scrolling through my phone when a message popped up. Samuel, you home tonight? Samuel was an African friend I'd met a few months earlier through mutual acquaintances. We weren't close, not really, but we talked from time to time. He had a way of asking how I was and actually waiting for the answer. That alone made our conversations feel different. Me, yeah. Just relaxing. A pause. Then another message. Samuel, I'm cooking tonight. You should come over for a bit. Just food and conversation. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My first instinct was to say no. A married woman going to another man's house at night, even as a friend, didn't sit right with me. I knew how it looked. I knew where assumptions could lead, but I was tired of eating alone. Tired of quiet evenings and unanswered thoughts. I told myself it was harmless. He hadn't crossed any lines before. He'd never made me uncomfortable. And I needed company, that was all. Just company. I typed back slowly. Me, and maybe for a short while. Almost immediately, he replied to Samuel, that's fine. No pressure. Those two words, no pressure, eased my hesitation more than I expected. I grabbed my coat, glanced once around the empty living room, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the street calm, but my chest felt tight with something I couldn't quite name. His house was warmly lit when I arrived. Music played softly inside, nothing loud, just a steady rhythm that felt inviting. When he opened the door, he smiled, genuine and relaxed. I'm glad you came, he said. So am I replied, surprising myself with how true it felt. Inside, the scent of spices filled the room. We talked about work, about life, about small things that slowly turned into deeper ones. He listened. He remembered details I'd mentioned weeks ago. And somewhere between laughter and shared silence, I felt a shift, subtle, unsettling. I told myself I could leave anytime. Still, when the door closed behind me, a quiet thought crossed my mind. This night is already more complicated than I expected. If you want, I'll continue with part 2. Where emotional pressure builds and boundaries start to blur. To gradually build emotional and physical tension, showing the narrator's inner conflict, subtle temptation, and the beginning of boundary crossing. This section deepens suspense and prepares the audience for the pivotal moment. The aroma of the food was irresistible, and I couldn't help but notice how thoughtfully he had prepared everything. The table was set with 2 plates, candles flickering softly, casting warm light across the room. It was intimate, yet casual, enough to make the evening feel like a shared secret. We sat down to eat, and conversation flowed easily. He asked about my work, my life at home, even about my husband in a way that felt oddly personal. I laughed at his jokes and smiled more than I realized. There was something magnetic about the way he listened. Every word I said seemed to matter. As the evening continued, the casual touches began. A hand brushing against mine while reaching for the water, an arm lightly resting near mine as he gestured while speaking. I knew it was innocent, but my heart raced in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was just friendliness. But even as I reassured myself, a part of me whispered that it wasn't that simple. He suggested we move to the couch to continue our conversation. The soft cushions, the dim lighting, and the slow, comfortable music made the room feel smaller, closer. We sat a little too near, shoulders brushing, and I felt a strange warmth spreading through me. "Do you trust me?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I hesitated. "Of course," I said, unsure why I was suddenly nervous. "Good," he said, leaning just a bit closer. There was a softness in his eyes, but behind it, I sensed something more, a quiet intensity one hadn't expected. My mind was spinning. Every rational thought about loyalty and boundaries was competing with an unexpected pull toward him. I felt guilty, afraid, and strangely alive all at once. I wanted to stop it, but I also didn't want to leave. And then, without warning, he reached out and took my hand. It wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate, and in that moment, the tension became undeniable. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. I wanted to pull away, to remind myself of my life and my vows. But something inside me, a mix of loneliness and curiosity, held me there. He whispered my name softly, just above the music, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was caught between reason and temptation, and I realized that leaving now would feel impossible. Something had shifted in the air, something unspoken but electric, and I could no longer deny it. For the first time that night, I understood that the simple visit I had thought would be harmless was slowly spiraling into something far more dangerous, something I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. Purpose of Part 2 recap: heighten the emotional and physical tension, gradually show the narrator's inner conflict and temptation. Introduce subtle touches and moments that push boundaries, prepare the story for the turning point in Part 3. If you want, I can continue with Part 3, 500 words, next, where the encounter escalates further and crosses emotional boundaries. Do you want me to do that?